Hello, my name is Jonathan Foe. I'm a retired teacher from UST. This is a PowerPoint I showed my students. I showed it to them because so many, about 1/3 of my students said that Marcos did a good job on the economy. And I disagreed. And I showed this PowerPoint that I had prepared for graduate school to illustrate why he was bad for the economy. So I will show it to you. You can make up your own choice if you want to. All this does is doesn't talk about this slideshow, though, does not talk about human rights abuses or the growth of the communists or anything like that. All it does is focus in on Marcos's handling of the Philippine economy. So let's get started. I will show that the Philippine economy did grow under Marcos, not as much as its neighbors, but up until about 1980. And then, about 1982, the Philippine government could no longer pay their debts, and the country was essentially bankrupt. It was a problem of Marcos borrowing too much money and spending the money unwisely. So here it goes. Now, when we talk about economics, you have to remember that the Philippines was especially a nation of poor people. And so these numbers tell a story of people's lives. And so when the economy collapses, it affects people's lives dramatically. Now, in the 1980s, the upper left-hand corner picture of the woman holding a sack, that was taken at Smoky Mountain. Smoky Mountain was the #1 tourist attraction in all of Metro Manila, and that had a smoking garbage dump mountain that people were awestruck. Then, one, that it was smoking. Two, the people were living there, collecting pieces of plastic or whatever. This was in Tondo. Now, Marcos ran on the platform in 1965, "We will make this country great again." And he was a dynamic president. This is true. The Philippine economy had done very, very well in the 1950s. When Macapagal, president, took over, the Philippine economy was doing well, but it started to have slower growth rates. In the 1950s, in fact, the Philippine economy was second only to Japan in terms of wealth. Then the Philippines became an embarrassment, and we'll go through it. So when Marcos came into power, the Philippine economy was doing quite well. It wasn't growing as fast as its neighbors, but was still very strong. With the actually photogenic couple comes their children, Amy on her left, on the president's right. Then the little girl in the middle, that's Irene, and then that's Bongbong, and that's the Lola. Now, President Marcos was a dynamic speaker and a dynamic leader. He built more schoolhouses and built more roads than all of the previous presidents had up till that time. So much more roads than Carino, much more roads than Macapagal, like that. Now, he built more than all of those previous presidents combined, but he did have 20 years to do it. And how he built them was to borrow heavily from the domestic banks and the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Now, When Marcos declared martial law in 1972, he said that his number one goal was to improve the economy so that the economy would have permanent growth. It didn't, but that's his promise. And now remember, when you are, say, President Duterte, you could blame any economic problem on the Supreme Court or on the Congress. But President Marcos, because he was a dictator from 1972 to 1986, he has no one else to blame but himself if the economy fails. Now, this is not a picture of permanent growth. In the middle of the graph, the economy collapses. We had economic growth in the 1970s, no doubt. But 1980, the Philippines suddenly sank. Now, exactly what happened? Was the Philippines' sinking economy due to factors beyond its control? No. Because if you look at this, the other nations of Asia are doing quite well, thank you. And the Philippines alone in 1960-70 has the lowest growth rate. Now remember, President Marcos took power in 1965. 1970 and 80, the Philippines had the second lowest growth rate. And then in the 80s, it minused 7. Pambihira talaga. How could it sink 7%? That means poor people getting poorer. This is a graphic example of those same statistics. The Philippines is what was called back then the sick man of Asia. Very little economic growth in those 30 years. Now, President Marcos was president for 20 years, but still during his time, the economy just sank. It tanked, in other words. Now, we take a look at two of our neighbors, Indonesia and Thailand. Now, in 1967, you can see that we were richer than they were. This is gross national product per capita or per person. Now, Indonesia's only got $50 per person in 1967. Oh, they must have been really poor. Thailand had $170 per person, while we had $210 per person. But if you look at the bottom, 1987, Indonesia had $450 per person. They had increased times 9. Thailand had increased times 10 to $840 per person, while we had increased maybe times 3 or 4. So we were increasing, but slowly, and those nations would overtake us in wealth. Now, I'm sorry that these slides are so malabo. It's because I had to copy them from books. So, in terms of gross national product growth rate, you can see that Indonesia and Thailand had faster growth rates. And then if you take a look at 1980 to 85, it was minus 0.3 for the Philippines during the same time. If you take a look at agriculture, Indonesia, top of the chart. Now, a nation does not want to be dependent on agriculture. Agriculture doesn't make that much money. Industry and manufacturing and services make more money. Now, in 1958, though, 1/2 of the Indonesian economy was based on agriculture. In Thailand, the same picture arises. 1950, 57% of the Thai economy was based on agriculture, inefficient agriculture. Yet in Indonesia, that dropped down to 26%. They have their importance on agriculture, and in Thailand, they really went down. It only went to 16%. Now, if you then take a look at industry, in Indonesia, it starts off at 17% of the economy and goes up to 33%. That's where the money is. Thailand was at 16%, went up to 35%. But the Philippines only went up 13 points. That's all. Very sad. Now, how did the economy expand during the 1970s? Because Marcos started borrowing money. Before him, Macapagal had to borrow some money in 1960. But by 1970, if you look at the percentage of the debt to our national budget, 30% of our national government budget went to repaying the debt. That went up to 43% in 1984. And a little bit down, 1986 to 34%. Our debt to gross national product, though, kept on going up, up, up. In other words, Marcos was sort of addicted to getting more money through debt. Like perhaps some of your neighbors who are so deeply in debt to the 5/6, they can't see out of their way. And in fact, in 1983, Marcos declared that he could no longer pay off the debtors, that he couldn't pay them off and they would have to do something else. And in order to get more money, he had to take out additional loans at higher interest rates. So, in the defense of Marcos, he did try to change the Philippine economy, and it really worked to a large degree. Before Marcos, our traditional exports had been tobacco, sugar, logs, and coconut products. Did you know, in fact, that the Philippines was the #1 log or wood exporter in all of Southeast Asia in the 1950s and 60s and 70s? Very sad, since we don't have a very big country to log all the forests, but that's what the situation was. But by the 1970s, electronic items and garments, in other words, clothing manufacture, that would be our new export. So here's where the logs were. So you say bye-bye trees, and then bye-bye sugar workers. Why I'm saying the sugar workers was because the price of sugar in the 1980s went way, 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 way down. And the sugar growers no longer could afford to pay the sugar workers very much money. And there was a high incidence of people starving to death in Negros, the island of, because these people were sugar workers, sacada, and they did not have full-time employment. So this is a woman working on garments. And this is a woman, very cute, working on Texas Instrument manufacturing in Baguio. And a lot of these people were women workers. Now, the problem, though, for the workers was that during the time of the new society under Marcos, you could not strike. Walang huelga, illegal. And their wages kept on going down. In fact, if you base it on inflation, the wages shrunk by 72%. So people could no longer afford any kind of luxury. All they could afford was buying food, paying the rent. That's all. Now, these brave women are going on strike even if it's bawal, it's forbidden to strike. And they were hiring for domestic helpers in Oman and Qatar. This is the start of the OFW because there was no jobs for Filipinos back then in the Philippines. So Marcos decided he would put technocrats and his friends into developing the economy. So Juan Ponce Enrile was in charge of logging. Eduardo Coonco was in charge of coconut manufacturing or coconut production. And other people were in charge of bananas and things like that. And this was supposed to centralize for central planning the Philippine economy, but it didn't work. For instance, you take a look at ABS-CBN, owned by the Lopezes. Marcos shut the company down and demanded that the Lopezes sell the government ABS-CBN for $1. Only $1, and that's what happened. These other nations, newly industrialized, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, they were doing exports successfully. The Philippines, not. So the gross national product, that means all of the sales of everything produced in the Philippines in any particular year, that exceeded, it went beyond the 1960s. So that was good. But by 1980s, the Philippines could no longer pay that debt. The reason why the GNP rates were so high in the 1970s, Marcos was borrowing money for his own private wealth and nothing and not much else. And there was so much corruption in the government. Now, Imelda went shopping in New York, in Paris, in London, other places. Ferdinand and Imelda are thought to have stolen about $10 billion. They say that's not true. But there's been a number of court rulings against them, and they are the #1 thieves in the Guinness Book of World Records. So, the problems in the 1980s really were insurmountable for Marcos. Very high interest rates because all of the excess money was going to fund the government debt. They couldn't find new revenue places to collect money from sales because people had very little money. Very little private investments were made because businessmen did not trust Marcos to lead the country out of a financial nightmare. So people did not invest in the Philippine economy. Government corporations grew large, but they were mismanaged by his crony friends. Exports did not keep up with growing debt. Graft and corruption was draining the national budget. When Imelda was kicked out of Malacañang in 1986, she had left behind her between 1,000 and 3,000 pairs of shoes. She had a shoe fetish. The foreign reserve money was dried up. With Dewey D, a friend of Marcos and Imelda, he was part of the Binondo Central Bank who loaned Marcos money when he ran out of cash. He fled to Canada, taking $80 million with him from out of the Philippines. There was weak internal demand. No one had additional money, and agriculture was still inefficient. So Marcos declared a debt moratorium in 1983. He still needed money though, and the IMF and World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank said we would loan you money, but they said that the first thing the number one, the biggest expenditure of your national budget must be repaying us first. Everything else comes second. Now, do a sideline. Here's again the Philippines 1970, and Indonesia 1970, Thailand 1970. Look at column 1. The Philippines had 50% of teenagers in high school. Philippines 1987, 68% of teenagers were in high school. That's an improvement. But look at Indonesia 1970, 15% were in high school. Then 1987, 41% were in high school. Almost times 4, times 3. Thailand, 18% were in high school. Then 1987, 29% were in high school. In Philippines, column 2, Philippines 1970, only 13% were in college. But by 1987, 38% were in college. Times 2.5 or something. But Indonesia, look, 1% of teenagers were in high school, were in college. Then 1987, 7% were. Did you know that in 1970, Indonesia only had one university in all of the country? Only one. Now you look at Thailand, where they used to send many of their promising students to the Philippines. 2%, they sent their students to school in the Philippines because the Philippines had such a good educational system. Thailand, 1970, 2% of teenagers were in college. Then Thailand, 1987, 20%. Quite a big improvement, wouldn't you say? Times 10. This is the Bataan nuclear power plant, a very bad example of Marcos corruption. This was built by Westinghouse. This was built for $2.4 billion. Although Westinghouse said that they could build it for $1.5 billion. The price ballooned up to 2.4. Now, in order to get this, this plant has not produced any electricity yet. None. Westinghouse admitted that they gave Disney, friend of Imelda, $50 million in cutbacks. There's also 4,000 defects in this particular plant. And Duterte asked how much money would it take to get this Bataan nuclear power plant back in operation, and the estimate was $6 billion. Now, so $2.4 billion. When did we stop repaying that? Only back in 2007. So that means your parents were stuck paying for this Bataan nuclear power plant that hadn't produced one tiny bit of electricity. And now it's just sitting there in Bataan. So there was political problems happening to Marcos. Nonoy Aquino came back, and then he was shot in the tarmac at Naiya. Then this was a photograph of the huge funeral parade that happened in Manila. So if you think that Filipinos used to be smarter, you are correct. Because, for instance, when I got here, I'd heard stories from different students in national high schools, in Parañaque specifically, that the class size was 70 students per class room. And there was only 40 chairs. And it was standing room only, walang fan. Could you imagine trying to study in something like that? Most students just dropped out. They couldn't stand it. The health budget was also slashed 50%. When I came here, Rojas Boulevard, a large highway, near Manila Bay, there was no lights. Wala, 1993, wala nang ilaw sa gabi. Now it's well lit up. But back then, nothing, because the government couldn't afford the street lights. How ridiculous. Okay, now, in all of this, the debt was not necessarily, it was started by our President Marcos, but you can see that the debt kept on growing up, up, up. That was the problem. Now, the top of the chart, you see debt payments in red, borrowings in blue. Marcos was the one who started it, but the debts were becoming up, and so Aquino had to borrow additional money to pay it back. And she started, during the end of her term, to pay back more than she was borrowing, except in 1992. Her regime was rocked by 3 coups d'etat, led by a military takeover of the government, led by Juan Ponce Enrile and Gringo Honasan. This lent instability, which meant high interest rates for the Philippine government. Now, the changes really started to happen under the Ramos administration. You can see there, like in 1993-94, he's really paying back the debt. The debt has become unmanageable, and he is paying it back. It isn't until 1998 that he has to borrow large amounts of money. Estrada was bad news. He borrowed a lot of money, and he messed up the Philippine economy, and we had very low growth rates. GMA Arroyo, say what you like or don't like about her, there's many things, but she did put the Philippine economy from a very high reliance on debt to an actual very low reliance on debt. We are only 36% of our budget now is on debt. That's thanks to Arroyo and thanks to Pinoy. So this is the 1970s and 90s as debt as percentage of the GNP, and it was really hard to get rid of that debt. So many needs came before paying off the debt, like education, people's welfare, the armed forces of the Philippines, those kind of things. But if you take a look at this, here we are. We're like number 8 or something in the Philippines after Thailand, which used to be like not a nothing country. And here we are, we're sinking below. And this is 2002. Indonesia now has a little bit more money than we do. So the Philippines, 1950s, had been second only to Japan. But by the 1980s, we had sunk so badly, we were known as the sick man of Asia. Okay, to put this into perspective, you'll notice that Southeast Asia has the highest growth rate of the other regions. The only other place that has a higher growth rate than us is China. So Southeast Asia is doing fine now. If you look at the little red line in the Philippines, this is the gross domestic product per capita, that means per person, at current rates. Now you can see that we're not doing so badly. We're kind of low in terms of, wealth, but at least we're growing at the same rate as the other countries. That's the good news. Now, so we're no longer the sick man of Asia. The Philippines is the funny little red dotted line in the middle. you can say that we kind of got really kind of low over there, but now we're doing okay. Then you take, now, by the way, this, this is Vietnam here. Vietnam is not here, right? And not here because it had a major civil war and the whole country was messed up because of the US invasion. But by 1981, its growth rates were quite high. And now it might be that Vietnam overtakes the Philippines in terms of wealth per person, per capita. We don't know. So, gross domestic product per capita, per person, Southeast Asian nations. Now, you can see that we're a little bit ahead of Vietnam and a little bit behind Indonesia now. Cambodia and Myanmar, they're walang cuenta sila. Malaysia is rich. Thailand is rich. And Singapore is off the charts. So our per capita growth, though, we are doing fine. At 4%, 4.6% in 2019, hey, that's not bad. That's almost as good as Cambodia, almost as good as Vietnam. So it's not like we're suffering. This last one, the point -4, that's Singapore. Economically, they aren't growing that fast anymore. Kahit mayaman sila. Okay, so this is where I got all of my information. So that's that.